This video is brought to you by Brilliant. At the beginning of the year, it looked like the Chinese economy was roaring to life post-pandemic. The property market, which has struggled with a series of high-profile defaults in the past few years, saw a promising uptick in home sales, and Chinese exports surged in March, despite weak global demand. According to official statistics, China's economy grew by 4.5% year-on-year in the first quarter of this year, or 2.2% compared to the previous year. This was well above analysts' expectations, and these numbers implied China might be able to make the CCP's 5% growth target for this year. However, China's most recent economic data has cast doubt on this narrative. While we don't have any headline GDP figures until the end of this quarter, data released last week for the month of May suggests that things aren't going great. Relative to earlier this year, Chinese consumers are spending less, Chinese factories are producing less, and China's debt-ridden property market, which accounts for something like 30% of all of China's economic activity, is looking at another slowdown. This slowdown has exacerbated China's youth unemployment crisis, and in May, China's urban youth unemployment rate hit 20.8%, the highest since records began in 2018. In response to the slowdown, last week the People's Bank of China cut interest rates and unveiled new tax breaks for businesses in an attempt to stimulate the economy. Now, it's worth noting quite how unusual this is. As you've probably noticed, the rest of the world is currently raising rates to combat inflation. But demand in China is so weak that they've been actively cutting rates recently. Despite these measures, analysts are still pessimistic. And last week, Morgan Stanley announced that it now expects China to see no growth in the second quarter. So in this video, we're going to look at what's gone wrong for the Chinese economy, how worried we should be about it, and what the CCP might do to fix it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, as we see it, the recent data implies that the Chinese economy is experiencing weakness in three places: the property sector, exports, and domestic demand. Let's start with the property sector. We've done a whole load of videos on China's property crisis before, but essentially, thanks to an unprecedented wave of urbanization, Chinese house prices started rising rapidly in the 80s. Anticipating further rises, China's real estate developers borrowed increasingly large amounts of money, and Chinese buyers poured basically all of their money into housing. This combination of over-leveraged developers and endless speculative investment in housing eventually created a massive property bubble. Property prices in large Chinese cities were 40 times the median salary, making them, by far and away, the most expensive in the world. Property now accounts for an estimated 75% of all Chinese household wealth and about 30% of all economic activity. Anyway, the CCP realised that China's property market had become a dangerously large bubble, and in late 2020, they introduced the so-called three red lines, which essentially limits the amount of money Chinese developers could borrow. This sparked a wave of defaults amongst over-leveraged developers, most notably Evergrande, and a small decline in house prices. While it looked like house prices might be on their way up earlier this year, property prices have started falling again in the last couple of months. Obviously, a slowdown in the property market is disastrous news for China's growth forecasts, given that it represents about 30% of all economic activity. On to the second weakness: exports. As you probably already know, China's economy depends on exports. China sells more stuff abroad than basically any other country, which is one of the reasons it runs by far and away the largest trade surplus in the world. Obviously, exports slumped during the pandemic when global demand was muted by lockdowns, and it was an open question whether China's exports would ever return to pre-pandemic levels, given all of the talk of decoupling and de-risking in the West. The US and the EU are China's biggest export markets, so if they really did decouple, you would have expected China's exports to fall significantly. However, earlier this year, things looked pretty rosy for the CCP. Despite all the talk of decoupling, China's exports jumped by nearly 15% in March. Unfortunately for the CCP, apparently this boom wasn't to last, and in May, exports fell by 7.5% year-on-year. On to the third and final weakness: domestic demand. Again, we've done a video on this topic before, but the basic idea is that GDP is composed of four things: investment, government spending, net exports, and domestic consumption. In China, consumption accounts for only about a third of China's GDP, the lowest of any major economy. In practice, your average Chinese person doesn't really buy or consume that much stuff, and the Chinese economy is instead mostly driven by Chinese businesses selling their stuff to foreigners. This is in part because the CCP actively promotes policies that allow businesses to essentially underpay their workers, because that in turn makes China's exports more competitive, and the CCP likes other countries depending on Chinese exports for strategic reasons. Anyway, in the past year or so, the CCP have started trying to boost domestic consumption to balance out their growth, with the hope that China's domestic market might one day provide an ample consumer base to Chinese businesses that currently depends on exports to foreign markets. Again, while it looked like things were going well earlier this year, in May, year-on-year retail sales, which are probably the best proxy for domestic demand, fell sharply from 18.4% in April to 12.7%. So you get the idea. The Chinese economy is struggling on at least three fronts. So what happens next? Well, interest rate cuts and looser lending practices might help stimulate the economy a bit, but there are no easy answers here. The property sector is a bubble that needs deflating, and while it might provide short-term relief, further stimulus will only inflate the bubble further and delay the inevitable pain. Similarly, there's not much the CCP can do about exports, because these mostly depend on international factors, like the economic strength of Western countries like the US and UK, which are China's main export markets, and the extent to which these Western countries decouple or de-risk from China. Finally, while recent comments and actions do suggest that China wants to rebalance its economy towards consumption, this won't be easy, and it'll require structural changes to China's economy. Anyway, having watched an 8-minute video explaining the intricacies of the Chinese economy, fair to assume you have a desire to learn and better your knowledge of politics and economics. Well, we've got something that you might enjoy and will continue your online educational journey. Brilliant. Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform where you can learn everything from quantum computing or algebra to logical decision making. And if you don't want to learn more about the world from simply just watching YouTube videos, then you're in luck, because Brilliant actually teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring you actually understand what's going on. And rather like a good TLDR news video, Brilliant breaks topics down into accessible chunks, which you can work through whenever you have time. There's no homework, there's no deadlines, and there's no core classes. You can spend anything from a few minutes to a few hours a day accumulating new knowledge in an actually fun way. So whether you want to brush up on your basic math skills, improve your employment prospects by learning about future technologies, or just have fun with coding, you can check out everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days. Click on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.